Good evening. It's June 19th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're watching our weekly Friday evening webcast from LaRouchepack.com. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review, as well as Jason Ross from the LaRouche Pack Science team. And we have a pretty full program in store for you here tonight, which I think will make clear to all of you who are viewing this webcast that we're in an absolutely extraordinary, unprecedented situation as it pertains to the global state of affairs and the future destiny of the human species and our responsibility in that regard. Let me begin by calling your attention to the fifth in an ongoing series of so-called fireside chats, which Mr. LaRouche has been personally engaged in with the American people every Thursday night. The fifth of these occurred last night. It was broadcast over YouTube Live on the LaRouche Pack website, as well as being a live conference call. This has been an expanding dialogue involving American citizens from all across the United States. And I think those of you who were directly involved in this discussion last night, either asking questions directly to Mr. LaRouche, or merely auditing the discussion via the telephone hookup or live on the internet, I think you'll all agree that these discussions are of a quality far beyond anything which is occurring in this country otherwise, as far as policy matters is concerned, or the seriousness and the scope of which this kind of dialogue is occurring among a collection of the American people, discussing this among themselves from all across the nation. And I think it demonstrates precisely what Mr. LaRouche has been discussing with us, including in a discussion earlier this week on Monday with the LaRouche Pack Policy Committee, when he described the process of leadership which is required to bring the citizens of a republic into harmony with one another. This is a process, as he described it, of unifying an increasing portion of society into a common sense of reality and a common sense of mission, regardless of their individual differences in terms of perspective, background, or specific talent. And Mr. LaRouche stressed that this is the real principle of a republic, as he identified it, an almost musical or choral principle of harmony. And I think that's what can be clearly witnessed by listening to these discussions on an ongoing weekly basis that are now taking place between Mr. LaRouche and an ever-broadening cross-section of the American population. And for that reason, I do think it was highly appropriate that towards the beginning of this discussion last night, Lin Yen, who is the founder of an organization called the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture, announced that her organization is sponsoring a concert in New York City this weekend, this Sunday at 4 p.m. at Carnegie Hall, which will be featuring three extraordinary performers. A pianist named Tiang Jiang, that some of you may know from the movie Mao to Mozart, about Isaac Stern's trip to China after the Cultural Revolution, an excellent Russian-American cellist named Borislav Strulyov, and Yegi Park, who is a 17-year-old violinist who has performed previously at events sponsored by the Schiller Institute in New York City. And this concert will feature music of Bach, Brahms, Schumann, and Chopin, and most significantly will be performed at the tuning of C equals 256, or A430 approximately. This is a first for Carnegie Hall, and it's something which the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement generally has championed for decades, and this was discussed in broad detail by Megan Beats during our New Paradigm show on this website on Wednesday. If you haven't viewed that, I would recommend it. We also have a lot of the background on this campaign available on our Classical Renaissance page on the LaRouche Pack website, which you can access via the drop-down menu at the top of the homepage or at LaRouchepack.com/classical renaissance. And if you are in New York City this weekend, or if you can make the trip to get there, I would highly recommend that you attend this historic concert. As Lin Yan announced last night, all of the information is available at the concert's website, which is 2015concert.com, or www.2015concert.com. And as it says on that website, this concert is dedicated to an end to the culture of war, violence, death, and slavery, and instead to the revival of a culture of beauty, harmony, life, and freedom, which is highly appropriate and timely considering the evil and tragic events that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina this week. Also, I would point out today is Juneteenth, the 150th anniversary of the holiday on which we celebrate the final emancipation of the slaves after the Civil War. Also participating in this event up in New York, delivering remarks during intermission, will be two individuals who are very significant. Terry Strada, who is known to many of you as the head of 9/11 Families and Survivors United for Justice Against Terrorism, who participated in the press conference a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., as well as Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who is chairman of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and who was central to the training of civil rights workers during the civil rights struggle in the 1960s in the methods of nonviolent action. So as I said, this will certainly be quite an important and timely event, both in terms of the music itself and from the standpoint of what we've been discussing, the ongoing efforts of the LaRouche movement and its collaborators to intervene into the culture of New York City and uplift it as a means of uplifting and organizing the entire United States and continuing to pull our population into a greater harmony with itself. Now, one other thing I just want to especially highlight before proceeding to the bulk of this evening's proceedings is the absolutely historic and internationally significant conference which the Schiller Institute hosted this past weekend in Paris, France. A press release detailing the participants and the presentations at this conference was published on the LaRouche PAC website earlier this week. This is a print-off of it. Schiller Institute Conference in Paris, Rebuilding the World in the BRICS Era. And the full proceedings of the conference have been published in the current issue of Executive Intelligence Review magazine, which I would highly recommend you obtain a copy of and study in detail. Now, just to give you a taste of the sheer magnitude of importance of this historic event and the caliber of the speakers who were involved, let me just read to you the first few sentences of this press release I just showed you about the conference. It reads as follows. On June 13th and 14th, eminent representatives of 3 of the 5 countries which make up the BRICS, from Russia, China, and India, as well as representatives of leading countries associated with them, were invited to Paris to speak at an exceptional international conference of the Schiller Institute on the theme, Rebuilding the World in the Era of the BRICS. The aim of this conference, which gathered about 500 people, was to bring to France and to Europe generally the winds of progress now blowing over the BRICS and their allies. This will help Europe rise against an international order which has nothing more to offer than the return of empires, the war of each against all, and the systematic looting of populations and public goods. The conference sharply attacked the Malthusianism spread by the climate change swindle and the World Summit on Climate currently being organized in France. That Malthusianism is the mortal enemy of the development of the BRICS and the rest of the planet. And I know that will be a theme that will be something that we'll elaborate later this evening in more depth with the presentation that Jason Ross will give. So instead of reading more of this here, I invite you again to study the full proceedings of the conference for yourself in the current issue of EIR. And let me just say that this conference couldn't have occurred at a more timely moment in world history, with a total revolt occurring against Obama from within his own party here in the United States, and a parallel revolt against Chancellor Merkel from within her own governing coalition in Germany. We're poised at the edge of what truly is a revolutionary moment in history, where literally everything could change overnight. It's a moment of great historic opportunity, but it's also a moment of great danger at the same time, and I know Jeff will elaborate that more. But with the coming disintegration of the Euro system, the showdown which is coming to a head this weekend in the case of Greece, and the utter bankruptcy of Wall Street, the clarity of leadership, which both Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche have provided and continue to provide, is absolutely indispensable. And this is a time at which an entirely new system will have to come into being if civilization as a whole is to survive. And I think Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras said it very clearly earlier today during his address to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in Russia. And I think his words echo almost verbatim the message that was delivered by the Schiller Institute conference in Paris last weekend. This is what Alexis Tsipras said. "The world is different from what it used to be in the past. We in Europe have for a long time had an illusion that we were the hub of the universe in the literal sense. We considered ourselves to be the center of the world. Nevertheless, the planet's economic center has already shifted from that place because newly emerging forces are coming to play a more vital role at the economic and the geopolitical levels. Increased cooperation among the BRICS countries indicates that a new economic world is being formed. The Eurasian Union, a new organization of regional integration, is a potential example of new sources for the production of wealth, benefits, and economic might. It must be taken into account that the center of gravity of global economic development is now shifting." So on that note, I want to invite Jeff Steinberg to come to the podium to elaborate a bit more on the dramatic and unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in, both here in the United States and internationally, and what responsibility that entails.
Thanks, Matt. As is regularly the case, Matt and Jason and I and a few other people had a chance this morning to have an extensive discussion with Mr. LaRouche. And so what we're going to be reviewing and discussing here for the balance of the show is very much a reflection of that discussion and of Mr. LaRouche's very important, powerful input. Now, many of you are aware that over the past week, we've had an extraordinary battle take place on Capitol Hill. Last Friday, a week ago, you had the defeat of President Obama and the Republicans on the issue of the Trade Adjustment Authority, which is a program to provide assistance and retraining to workers in the event that they lose their jobs as the result of the inevitable consequences of the free trade agreements that previous administrations and now Bush is attempting to push through. That was a stunning defeat on the part of President Obama's own Democratic Party, of his treachery in aligning with the Republicans against the most fundamental interests of the American people. And so what we saw happen over the past 48 hours is that President Obama took an even more treasonous second bite of the apple. A revote was presented on the fast-track authority in the House of Representatives, minus any attempt to provide any of the legislative assistance to workers who are going to be badly damaged, no question, if this free trade deal goes through. Obama had a choice: align with the Democrats, try to come up with some kind of vast improvement, or make a rotten deal with the Republicans, stab the Democratic Party in the back, and go for a marginal victory on that basis. And that's exactly what the president did. He made it clear that he is nothing but a son of a Bush. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Republican in the tradition of Bush and Cheney. And in a certain sense, the overwhelming question that remains to be answered is whether or not the Democrats, who have been betrayed by this president time and time again, but now in the most explicit Republican partisan way, will take the necessary steps and bring this presidency to an end, not in January of 2017, but in the immediate days and weeks ahead. This move by Obama reflected a degree of desperation. And this is by no means, at this point, a done deal. Sometime next week, it's very likely that there will be a vote in the Senate on whether or not the Senate will have a bill that matches the House bill, giving the president fast-track authority on negotiating the two major free trade agreements that he's got on his plate, minus any protection for workers who will suffer tremendously, who will lose their jobs, who will see wages and benefits decline as the result if this deal goes through. So now you've got Obama lined up with the Republicans, abandoning any responsibility for the American people and plunging ahead in a rotten British free trade deal. It's not certain that he's going to succeed in the Senate. This will require the Democrats completely throwing in the towel, and quite likely that is not going to happen. Harry Reid has already said that he's prepared to filibuster, and the Republicans and Obama, no matter how much arm twisting they do, don't have the votes. Now, another critical development that took place this week was a report that was issued by the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, in which they said very plainly, with full documentation, that we're back in an even bigger bubble than we had in 2008 when the bottom fell out on the whole system. What they reported is that the amount of derivatives and other gambling debt that has been accrued on the books of the major big commercial Wall Street banks is now greater than the amount of debt that existed at the time of the Lehman Brothers blowout in September 2008. The new figure is $29.5 trillion. Now, Mr. LaRouche responded to this by saying that, quite simply, the world will not survive unless we go immediately with an international Glass-Steagall. And that's got to begin here in the United States immediately. So the impeachment of Obama is now an urgent matter for consideration by Democrats who have no excuses anymore. Go back to the early 1970s. It was the Republicans who realized that Richard Nixon was a menace to the Republic, a menace to the Republican Party. And it was the Republicans who actually put the final nails in the political coffin of Richard Nixon by forcing his resignation. That's what's on the plate of any honest Democrat that has any degree of concern for the country. Because if Obama remains in office under the desperate conditions that he faces here in the United States, in some respects the conditions in Europe with the showdown by Monday on the Greek debt is even more desperate. What Mr. LaRouche pointed out in a very important statement that was just simply published earlier today is that the real issue for Europe is the bankruptcy of the entire British-created Euro system. Greece is not bankrupt. In fact, a Greek government commission, the Truth Commission, came out with their report this week, and they basically reiterated what Mr. LaRouche has been saying for a very, very long time, namely that there is no legitimate Greek debt obligation to the Troika or to other creditors. All of that debt, the so-called debt, is nothing but the looting of Greece, and there's no legitimate obligation to pay back any of that debt. The real issue is that nothing can be resolved in Europe so long as there is the continuing pretense that the euro is a viable system. The euro is bankrupt, and the reason that there is panic right now over the negotiations with Greece is that it's not Greece that faces an economic breakdown. It's the entire euro system. There's nothing that can be done to solve the Greek crisis or any other crisis so long as the euro system remains intact, because it will be a drain. It's a massive pile of illegitimate gambling debt that's hanging over the lives and over the economies of the real countries and the real people of Western Europe. So what we're really seeing is a showdown moment where the bankruptcy of the system in Western Europe is being called into question by virtue of what the Greeks are insisting now, which is that there's no debt obligation to the Troika. In fact, as Mr. LaRouche pointed out, were Greece to leave the euro and were the euro system to be dismantled and countries of Europe were to return to their sovereign currencies of the pre-Maastricht period, then Greece would be fine. The Greek drachma would not collapse in value, but would actually be raised in value. Greece, as Matt indicated, has been participating in the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. There was a meeting between Prime Minister Tsipras and President Putin. Russia has announced several $billion in investment in building a major gas storage facility, part of the Turkish Stream gas pipeline that will be going into southern Europe via Turkey and then into Greece. There are real prospects for a Greek economic recovery. Greece has been historically a major shipbuilding country. It's now located in a critical port area with plans with China to build rail links and other links up into the entire Danube River basin of Europe. So the real prospects of a viable future for Greece, a strong drachma, a real economic recovery are there, but only provided that this poisonous euro system is finally recognized as a bankrupt hulk that must be immediately brought down and replaced by a system of reinstatement of Glass-Steagall in the United States and the establishment of Glass-Steagall full bank separation in Europe. The entire British system needs to be simply eliminated because it's nothing but a pile of gambling debt that's choking the life out of humanity in the transatlantic region. Now, Mr. LaRouche had a very pointed comment on the situation because we are now in a new game as the result of Obama flagrantly abandoning the entire Democratic Party and basically throwing in his lot 100% with the most rotten Republican elements. What Mr. LaRouche said in the discussion earlier today was Obama and the British have no option at this point except to launch war. Therefore, we have reached the point of greatest danger to civilization imaginable. We know the history of the British dynasty. They are on a confrontation course with history. Now, in previous weeks, we've reviewed the situation on the Eastern Front, the various provocations against Russia. Throughout the next several-month period, there are virtually continuous NATO maneuvers, war games taking place on various of the Russian border areas, both land borders and sea borders. Right now, there are maneuvers underway, still continuing for several more days in the Baltic Sea. There are planned maneuvers in Poland that are ongoing. So all of the elements are in place, and of course the U.S. is threatening to abandon the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty and once again place intermediate range nuclear warheads in Western Europe. So this is deadly serious. Mr. LaRouche continued. He said there are two major targets as such: the British Empire and the problems of the United States, which can be summarized as Barack Obama and the Bush tradition. The Bushes, he said, are nothing. They stink, they're evil, they're nasty, and the current generation is dumber than their ancestor Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush was pro-Nazi before it came into vogue. Prescott Bush is the signature of the entire Bush family dynasty. He set the course for the entire Bush family. Prescott's embrace of Hitler and the Nazi Party. This disgraceful history is the Bush family legacy. So for Democrats, the question is on the table. Will you show the courage, now that the president has clearly made his choice, has clearly aligned himself with the British Empire, with the worst Bush elements in the Republican Party? He's committed the crimes. The question is, will the Democrats have the guts and have the sense of patriotic duty to move immediately on either impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Obama from office before he, as an instrument of the British Empire, starts a war that will lead to nuclear war, thermonuclear war, and the likely annihilation of mankind?
Now, to follow up what Jeff has just had to say, especially regarding the genocidal proclivities of the British monarchy, both presently and historically, and also to set up the next segment of our broadcast here this evening, let me read our institutional question for this week, which we did have an opportunity to discuss with Mr. LaRouche in detail earlier this afternoon when we met with him. And what I'll do is ask Jeff to come back to the podium to very briefly deliver Mr. LaRouche's direct response to this, and then we'll segue directly into the presentation from Jason Ross, who will elaborate in more specific detail the scientific background behind the answer to this question. So the question reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, Pope Francis this week issued a sweeping 184-page papal letter, writing that climate change is a global problem with far-reaching environmental and social consequences, especially for the poor. He blamed apathy and greed and called on developed countries to limit the use of non-renewable energy and to assist poorer nations. He called on humanity to collectively acknowledge a sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women, upon which all civil society is founded, and wrote that climate change represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. In one particularly direct passage, he writes, quote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. In many parts of the planet, the elderly lament that once beautiful landscapes are now covered in rubbish. Frequently, no measures are taken until after people's health has been irreversibly affected," unquote. The Pope is calling for fossil fuels to be, quote, progressively replaced without delay. Mr. LaRouche, our question for you is, in your view, will His Holiness's encyclical contribute to a new generation of nuclear and fusion energy to replace fossil fuel consumption? So, Jeff.
Well, of course, Mr. LaRouche is one of the leading voices in favor of a massive expansion of nuclear power and of a crash project, a Manhattan Project, to realize the long overdue potentiality of thermonuclear fusion. And that could be accomplished within the next decade were there to be the kind of concerted international effort. But that really is an issue that's an aside to what really is being raised both in the encyclical and in the fact that one of the most notorious genocidalists alive today, Schellenhuber, was part of the sort of festivities as the papal encyclical was being rolled out. And Jason will have a lot more to say to elaborate on that point. But Mr. LaRouche's comment was very brief. He said the Pope in his encyclical has not located the actual cause of what he presented as evidence. Those of us who do know the history and the technology are in a better position to respond to the pure evil of Schellenhuber. Schellenhuber represents precisely the kind of filth and pollution that the Pope should be happy to see gone. So on that, I'll pass things on to Jason.
That certainly sets it up pretty well. So Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, who is this guy? He is, first let me get his name properly, Professor Dr. Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, honorary commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. I think he goes by John, though. Schellenhuber was the leading scientist, so-called, advising the Vatican, advising the Pope on the matters of what came out in this encyclical. And it is, in regards to the global warming side of things, I mean, there are very legitimate concerns about the poor having a good quality of life, about pollution, which, in the real sense of pollution, does exist and is a problem. Global warming isn't. It's not that's not an actual issue. What Schellenhuber's proposing, what ends up coming across in this encyclical, is a form of tyranny. The most direct sort of oligarchical tyranny that you could imagine, and it's not science. So let me, I'd like to read something that Mr. LaRouche said back in 2011 in response to the honorary commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Hans Joachim Schellenhuber's report with the WBGU. That's the organization that he heads. It's the German Advisory Council on Climate Change. And in 2011, this group put out a report called World in Transition, Social Contract for a Great Transformation. Now, LaRouche had read over this report, and what he said about it was that this wasn't science, this was the imposition of oligarchical tyranny. He said, instead of it, we have to have a form of practiced freedom. Here's one paragraph. LaRouche wrote in 2011 in, I'll give you the title, in a paper called That Which Could Not Be Sustained. He said, it is not sufficient, therefore, merely to denounce that ancient inherent evil into which the promoters of the referenced WBGU statement have been lured. We must affirm the truth which must supersede and uproot such kinds of evil. The necessary action is not to simply denounce the errant proposition. The urgent need is to replace it with a truthful account of the nature of mankind. So let's learn more about Schellenhuber and his background, and then return to the encyclical and where we really ought to be going, laying out, as LaRouche put it, the truthful account of the nature of mankind. So, Schellenhuber, he helped set up the East Anglia University Climate Unit. He ran it from 2001 to 2005. This is the group that you may be familiar with in ClimateGate, where emails were leaked about how they were keeping data from people, falsifying temperature records, etc. That's Schellenhuber. In 2004, he was sent, along with a Brit, to go visit George Bush. He was sent by Queen Elizabeth II to try to get George Bush on board the global warming campaign. That didn't work. In 2004, also, later that year, there was an event at the British Embassy in Berlin. It was called the British-German Climate Conference. Queen Elizabeth II herself attended this conference, as did Schellenhuber. This is where he was made a honorary commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. He had been Merkel's advisor ever since she was environment minister. And then around the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, which, again, Queen Elizabeth II herself made a major push for among the Commonwealth nations, Schellenhuber worked directly with Prince Charles on preparations for the conference. That conference, you may remember, was kiboshed by the Group of 77, which called the plans for decarbonizing a suicide pact. So what is being proposed here? The idea of eliminating fossil fuels and replacing them with renewables, which are not going to be able to support a civilization at a decent standard or be able to support the 7 billion people we have on the planet at present. The proposal is, very simply, population reduction, enforced poverty, and the reign of Zeus, who insisted that humankind would not have fire. Prometheus brought fire to mankind. Zeus's outlook was no. This is going to be reserved to the gods. The same kind of outlook seen by these seemingly environmentalist groups. In this program of his, Schellenhuber said that the transformation towards a low-carbon society is therefore as much an ethical imperative as the abolition of slavery and the condemnation of child labor. To make it clear, though, he did not propose using nuclear power. He said Fukushima should scare us all away from that, and that what would be required to implement this world structure would be a new United Nations organization. He said we would have to have a new council, a Council for Sustainable Development, on par with the UN Security Council. And we'd have to have a World Commission for Low-Carbon Urban Development. To implement this program, you really would have to have a world dictatorship, which he's asking countries to willingly join him on. So, you know, it's very unfortunate that the encyclical that the Pope released was created by the likes of Schellenhuber. Here's one quote from the encyclical that we'll come to. The idea of infinite or unlimited growth, which proves so attractive to economists, financiers, and experts in technology, is based on the lie that there is an infinite supply of the Earth's goods, and this leads to the planet being squeezed dry at every limit. Let's think about that. If we exist in a world of technology, this is actually true. If we have technology but no science, yes, the resources available to us are limited. The fact of the matter is that human beings are scientists. We create resources. That is the nature, that's the true nature of humanity as a species on the planet. And I want to take that up on a specific example of water. Now, last week we discussed energy flux density as a metric for understanding economic growth and development. You know, what is the concentration of energy that's available? And over the time period, for example, of the history of the U.S., we went from the wood era to the coal era, where the energy was of a dense enough form that it could power steam engines, create motion from heat, pretty amazing, to the era of petroleum, natural gas, the internal combustion engine, to the beginnings of the nuclear era. Now, the kinds of resources these things make available are tremendous. The power of chemical bonds is 100,000, 1,000,000 times greater than physical forces. The power in the nucleus, again, is about 100,000 times greater than the power of chemical changes. By moving towards higher levels of energy flux density, we create resources where they did not exist before and are able to support an increasing population, including having the free energy to make sure that we're able to take care of legitimate environmental and pollution concerns, which do exist and should be addressed. But some people don't want to address this, and they have the goal of, as I've been saying, eliminating the world's population. Take Prince Philip. In a foreword to his 1986 book called If I Were an Animal, I don't know if it was a piece of fiction or not, he says, "I just wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would be its feelings towards the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus in order to kill people." It's a very sweet image he has. Now, returning to this idea of limited resources, here's a headline from a New York Times article about California. California drought tests history of endless growth. The New York Times wrote, "A punishing drought is forcing a reconsideration of whether the aspiration of untrammeled growth that has for so long been the state's engine has run against the limits of nature." This is what's being said about California. There's no water, the state has too many people, it's just too late, and there's nothing that we can do about it. You know, and as we've discussed here in our other programs, it's just not true. Desalination is not very expensive. It's certainly something that could be done for the coastal regions of the state. More importantly, and on a broader scale, is transforming the weather. And understanding this requires thinking about ourselves not as species of planet Earth, but as a galactic species, as a galactic humanity. The galaxy influences weather. The sun influences weather. Changes in the sun's activity, which cause changes in the galactic cosmic rays reaching the Earth, change the cloud cover on the planet. Researchers have reconstructed the path of our solar system through the arms of the galaxy and reconstructed the effects that that had on our climate on a broad scale. Cycles of changing biodiversity on the planet over evolutionary time correspond to this motion through the galaxy, as do other geological cycles and volcano activity even. So we can use insights gathered from understanding how our planet, how our solar system as a whole is impacted by its real environment, the solar system and the galaxy, to ourselves create ionization systems to form our own clouds, to form our own rain, to be able to control the weather in a way that we currently control other things. You know, we use electricity. We change the temperature in buildings when, in developed nations. We're able to move water from place to place. We can also control it in the atmosphere. And there is no reason not to be doing this, not to be building these systems in California right now. As a matter of fact, weather isn't something that only happens on the Earth. You may have heard about Mars's ice caps changing over recent years. The winds of Venus have gone from 300 kilometers an hour in 2006 up to 400 kilometers an hour in 2013. The Great Red Spot of Jupiter is half the size it was 150 years ago. Saturn has a storm every Saturn year, every 29 of our Earth years. This time it's 7 years early. Why? Why do Uranus and Neptune have the incredible wind speeds that they have? Weather's changing all over the place, and it would be very silly to say that human beings are the only cause of such changes, to not take up a broader study and perhaps rename the IPCC instead of being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to be Interplanetary Comparative Cosmoclimatology. How does the solar system respond to the sun? What effect does the galaxy have on the system as a whole? These are the kinds of questions that we're able to answer and that give us the power to move to the next level of human development. These are the sorts of things that in the grand scale will be coherent with developing a fusion economy, which is really the next stage of fire, the next stage of energy flux density that's needed to move into the future. If we reject that kind of change, if we reject moving upwards in that way, then, yes, resources become limited. If we don't reject that, if we develop higher forms of power, then we remind ourselves, and we do create new resources and find better ways of managing the ones that we currently have. So clearly, I just hope I'm not giving. Clearly, the Pope isn't trying to do something, bad here. I don't think that's his intention at all. But he's got a very direct operative of the British Empire, Schellenhuber, working with him, drafting this material, and it represents this oligarchical outlook that still plagues the planet, that there really should only be a couple of billion people on the planet, and that they should not be at a high level, that we should go back, we should use renewables. The technology of using the sun and the wind, that existed a few centuries ago. You can't support 7 billion people by those techniques. We can support the future with fusion power and by fully implementing nuclear.
Thank you very much, Jason. Now, just to say in conclusion, I do want to come back to the emphasis that I put on this Schiller Institute conference, which occurred last weekend in Paris, France, and really implore upon all of you to read the full transcript of this in the current edition of Executive Intelligence Review. The final panel of that conference, the fifth panel, which happened on the second day, also dealt with a lot of the subject matter that Jason just covered. One of the speakers on that panel was Benjamin Deniston, who has done a lot of the original work on these questions relating to the water crisis in California and what we can do as mankind to change weather systems here on Earth. And then there were other speakers who joined him on that panel. So that's one of the subject matters that was taken up, in addition to all of the other panels with the high-level representatives and participants from Russia, from China, from India, from related nations, and then also the keynote speech which Helga Tsepp-LaRouche delivered, and the speech that Jacques Cheminade, the Mr. LaRouche's co-thinker and collaborator in France, delivered. So again, I emphasize to you, get a copy of the current edition of Executive Intelligence Review, study it in depth, and just internalize how crucial this event was last weekend in Paris, France, and how central of a role the LaRouche movement, both here in the United States and internationally, is playing in shaping the future destiny of human civilization. So I'm going to bring a conclusion to our discussion here today. I want to thank both Jeff and Jason for joining me here, and thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned to LaRouchePack.com. Please anticipate the upcoming fireside chat, which will be occurring again next Thursday evening. We will be broadcasting it live as we did this week via the website and also on the conference line as we have been doing. And please help us expand the participation of this event as much as we can between now and then. So thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.